Welcome to HOA Karen Expose. Like, comment your story, and subscribe for daily neighborhood drama. Imagine living in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Neighbors wave hello, lawns are neatly trimmed, and there's a strong sense of community. Then, out of nowhere, something strange happens. People start receiving fines, just for hanging American flags outside their homes. No warning. No explanation. Just letters in the mail demanding money. Confusion spreads fast. Why would something so harmless, so patriotic, suddenly become a problem? The answer? A new HOA board member had recently taken charge. And she wasn't just any board member. This one was strict, stubborn, and loved enforcing rules to the extreme. She quickly gained a reputation. You know the type. Someone always ready to correct others, always convinced they know best. The neighbors started calling her Karen, not just behind her back, but sometimes right to her face. She didn't like that. And what did she do in response? Doubled down. Made even more rules. Enforced them without question. The flag rule came out of nowhere. One day, people were proudly flying their flags. Many of them veterans, others just regular citizens showing love for their country. The next day, letters appeared on their doors. Violation of HOA regulations. $100 fine for unauthorized display. Some were even threatened with repeat fines if the flags weren't removed in 24 hours. It didn't matter if the flag was on a pole, hanging from a porch, or even placed in a flower pot. If it was visible, it was a violation. People were shocked. Not just because of the rule, but because of the way it was enforced. Cold, impersonal, and without any discussion. There were no community meetings. No chance to ask questions. Just instant penalties. And the person behind it. Karen. She claimed the flags were visual clutter, and could be divisive. But her timing couldn't have been worse. What she didn't know, or maybe didn't care to know, was that the neighborhood had a deep connection to the military. Many of the homeowners were veterans. Some had fought in wars. Others had lost family members in service. To them, the flag wasn't decoration, it was personal. So you can imagine how they felt being told they couldn't fly it. At first, there was confusion. People asked around. Tried calling the HOA office. Left messages. Most of them went unanswered. Then came the anger. Group chats filled up. Neighbors started talking to each other in person more than they had in months. They were united, not just by the flags, but by the feeling that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't about a rule. It was about control. And they were ready to push back. But they didn't just react emotionally. They wanted to do it the right way. Carefully. Legally. Respectfully. But firmly. And that's when things started to get really interesting. Karen kept pushing. Despite the growing frustration in the neighborhood, she didn't back down. In fact, she started doubling the fines for repeat offenders. Some homeowners were now being charged $200, even $300, just for keeping their flags up. One elderly veteran, who had flown the same flag since moving in 20 years ago, received 3 violation notices in a week. He was furious, but more than that, he was heartbroken. People like him weren't trying to make a statement. They weren't trying to rebel. This wasn't about politics. It was about pride. About honoring the country they had served. But Karen didn't seem to care. She made it clear in her emails and letters. Rules were rules. And she was just doing her job. Her tone was always the same. Cold, formal, dismissive. All residents are required to comply with HOA Regulation 4.2a regarding exterior displays, she wrote. No exceptions will be made. What she failed to realize was that her no-exceptions approach had started something much bigger than a neighborhood disagreement. People were talking. Not just within the community, but outside of it too. Word was spreading. A local news outlet picked up the story, then another. Soon, the headlines were popping up online. Veterans fined for flying American flags, HOA cracks down on patriotism, neighborhood uprising against HOA overreach. And while the press was heating up, so was the neighborhood. Meetings started happening. Real ones this time. Not run by the HOA, but by the residents themselves. They gathered in garages, on porches, even on Zoom calls. They compared letters, shared experiences, dug through HOA bylaws. And then someone brought up something important: the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. A federal law passed years ago that protects homeowners' rights to fly the American flag, no matter what an HOA says. That changed everything. People began printing copies of the law. They brought it to meetings, posted it on community message boards. Some even taped it to their front doors, right next to their flags. They weren't just resisting anymore. They were making a statement. Calm, lawful, and impossible to ignore. But Karen still wasn't giving up. She sent out more notices. Threatened legal action. Said the federal law didn't override local rules. She was wrong. And she was about to find out just how wrong. Because by now, some of the veterans had called in legal help. And not just any help. They brought in attorneys who specialized in HOA abuse and civil rights. These lawyers didn't just know the law. They knew how to fight. What started as a few fines had now become a full-on legal battle. And Karen. She wasn't just annoying anymore. She was under serious scrutiny. And then, almost overnight, things took an unexpected turn. The complaints against Karen had reached the local authorities. Not just the angry emails and frustrated calls. Actual, formal complaints. People had started documenting everything. Copies of letters. Voicemails. Even video footage of Karen walking through the neighborhood, snapping pictures of flags like she was a code enforcement officer. Residents were tired of being intimidated, and now they had proof that something wasn't right. Then came the moment no one saw coming. A police car rolled into the neighborhood. At first, people thought it was routine. Maybe just a patrol. But the officer wasn't just passing through. He parked right in front of Karen's house. A few neighbors watched from behind curtains. Others stood outside, pretending to water their lawns, just to see what was going on. Within minutes, Karen was outside, arguing with the officer. Her voice was raised, hands waving. But it didn't matter. The officer stayed calm. He asked her to step aside. Then, he handed her a document. It was a summons. Turns out, Karen had gone too far. One of the veterans she had fined, an older man with a clean record and decades of service, had filed a harassment claim. And he wasn't the only one. Multiple reports had been submitted, and after a short investigation, the police had enough evidence to act. Karen wasn't just facing public backlash anymore. She was facing legal consequences. When the officer left, Karen didn't come back outside for hours. Her blinds stayed shut. Her porch light, usually on until late, stayed dark. The woman who had once walked around the neighborhood with a clipboard and a sense of power was now nowhere to be seen. And just like that, the mood in the neighborhood changed. People started coming out again. Flags that had been taken down went right back up. Neighbors smiled more. Spoke to each other more. It felt like the fear had lifted. The tension that had hung over the streets for weeks was finally breaking. But no one was celebrating just yet. Because the legal process was just beginning. And the HOA still hadn't reversed the fines. But there was one thing everyone agreed on now. They weren't going to back down. The veterans had found their voice. The community had found its unity. And Karen. She had finally been held accountable. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because what happened next would make this neighborhood battle go from a local scandal to something much bigger. Something that would catch the attention of people far beyond their quiet little street. After Karen was served the summons, word spread fast. Residents who hadn't been involved before were now paying attention. People who had stayed silent out of fear or frustration were suddenly speaking up. More complaints were filed, this time not just against Karen, but against the HOA board itself. Some residents even started digging through old HOA records, looking for signs of other abuses of power. What they found shocked them. It turned out Karen had been pushing through new policies without following proper procedure. No votes, no meetings, no transparency. She'd been running things her way, acting like the HOA was her personal kingdom. And most people hadn't noticed until it affected them directly. Now, it was all out in the open. With the community fired up and united, they decided to take things a step further. A petition was launched to remove Karen from the board entirely. Within 48 hours, it had more than enough signatures. People weren't just angry anymore, they were organized. And that made all the difference. At the next official HOA meeting, something unusual happened. The room was packed. Standing room only. People brought copies of emails, fine notices, and the federal law protecting flag displays. One by one they spoke. Calmly. Clearly. No shouting. Just facts. Veterans talked about their service. Families talked about what the flag meant to them. Others talked about how scared they had felt being threatened for doing something so simple and legal. Karen was there too, sitting at the front, looking small for the first time. No clipboard. No smug attitude. Just silence. When the motion to remove her from the board was brought forward, no one objected. The vote was unanimous. But that wasn't the end. With Karen off the board, the community pushed for more changes. They rewrote outdated policies. They added clear protections for veterans and their right to display flags. More importantly, they brought in legal oversight to make sure nothing like this could happen again. They weren't just reacting anymore, they were rebuilding. And while most people were ready to move on, there was still one big issue left: the fines. Some homeowners had paid them, just to avoid trouble. Others had them hanging over their heads like a threat. But now that Karen was gone, the board reviewed every case. One by one, the fines were dropped. Refunds were issued. Apologies were given. And finally, justice felt complete. Still, the story didn't stay local. A video of the packed HOA meeting went viral. News stations picked it up. It wasn't just about flags anymore. It was about standing up to abuse of power. About protecting your rights. About what can happen when a group of ordinary people decide they've had enough. And while Karen faded from view, the neighborhood stood proud. Flags waving, heads high, stronger than ever. But there's still one more twist to this story. And it's the part nobody expected. Just when the dust seemed to settle, the unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the home of one of the veterans. This time, not from the HOA, but from a federal organization. It was an official notice acknowledging the neighborhood's actions, and more importantly, their stand for veterans' rights. The story had reached national groups that advocate for veterans and constitutional freedoms. They wanted to highlight what this small community had done. Shortly after, a few of the residents were invited to speak at a local event honoring veterans. One of them, an older man who had served in the Navy, shared the story of how their own HOA tried to silence something as basic as flying the American flag. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. He didn't speak like a politician. He just told the truth. And people listened. The community received a recognition plaque. A small gesture, but it meant everything. It wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about knowing that their stand mattered. That what they did wasn't just for themselves, but for other neighborhoods where people might feel powerless against overreaching HOAs. Back at home, things felt different. Neighbors who had never talked much before now waved and chatted regularly. Kids rode their bikes freely again. People decorated their porches, not just with flags, but with flowers, lights, and welcome signs. There was a sense of peace. But more than that, a sense of pride. Karen's house eventually went up for sale. Some said she moved out of embarrassment. Others said she just couldn't handle the pressure anymore. Either way, she was gone. And no one missed her clipboard. The HOA, now with new members and a more transparent process, started working with the community instead of against it. Meetings were open. Decisions were voted on properly. And most importantly, no one ever received another fine for flying a flag again. What started as a single rule enforced by one entitled person became a powerful example of how unity, respect, and persistence can make real change. The veterans didn't fight with anger. They fought with dignity. And in the end, they reminded everyone what the flag really stands for. Not control. Not power. But freedom. And the right to live in peace, without fear, in your own home. And that's something no Karen can ever take away.